Hello, dear friends. As always, this is Office and Law and Order in the USA with Detective Steve Doudnik. And today our guest is Pavel Shchelin. Pasha, thank you so much for coming. Thank you very much. I rushed in, sat right down in front of the screen, so I didn't really get into the stream vibe yet. You know, what can I tell you? The situation is actually very interesting. Today I was out running errands. I went to the police. I was at court. People are talking. And for some reason, everyone is already talking about World War III. That Russia will help Iran will bomb America, and all that, everything is just, kind of foggy. And everyone seems a bit on edge. We keep getting these confusing news reports from the TV. Like Iran asked Russia for help, and now Russia is supposedly going to give Iran a nuclear bomb. I take all this a bit more calmly. I understand that the people in charge over there, they think differently, they see things from another perspective, and all of this is just hype. That's it. Or maybe I'm wrong. Can you explain something to me? The strike by Israel against Iran. Do you think it was necessary to do that? Or is it the same kind of story as with Iraq, where they said there were chemical weapons that didn't actually exist?
That's the million-dollar question, Steve, Butterflies don't bring me anything. You too, I guess. So we can't really know anything for sure here. I totally get why people are feeling anxious about this. Let's be honest. The way this event has been communicated, especially on Twitter by a certain well-known politician, really encourages a state of constant anxiety, considering, let's say, how fast he spins things and how contradictory his messages are. So it's understandable that people, as I said, have some fundamental doubts. To your question, was it worth it or not? You see, the question of was it worth it or not always depends on the goal that's been set. In other words, we basically can't answer whether an action was worth it or not if we don't know what the person wants to achieve with that action. And here I actually have a big question, which maybe you can answer for me as someone who is deeply familiar with, let's say, the specifics of Israel. What exactly did Israel want? Because the answer to that question is exactly what determines whether this strike was worth it or not.
Yeah, I'm listening.
No, I just mean, what are the possible versions, the possible motives, right? So the first version.
There are versions. There are some. First of all, I want to separate the Israeli people and Netanyahu into two completely different boxes, so they're not in the same box at all. Because as far as I understand, for Netanyahu, aside from the talk about needing to save Israel from future nuclear destruction, he also has his own personal goals that he's pursuing. And you and I both know that this goal is to avoid criminal prosecution, to hold on to power, to not lose his job, so to speak, in this war, especially if it ends in victory, would be a big boost for him. But what the Israeli people want is unclear because some want one thing, others want something else. Some are for it, others are against it. Well, that's always how it is with Jews, when there are two Jews together and a third one comes along.
Three opinions.
Yeah, exactly. There are three opinions or even four or more, right?
Yep.
So,
well, look, even with Netanyahu, I'm not arguing with you about what the Israeli people want. I honestly have no way of knowing. I'm looking specifically at the elites who made the decision. What options do I see? Option 1. Objectively, the destruction of Iran's entire nuclear military program and, let's say, the destruction of Iran's military missile program. That's the first possible objective. The second possible objective, complete denuclearization, ensuring the total and permanent denuclearization of Iran. That's the second possible objective. The third possible objective, overthrowing the regime in Iran, and then installing a new regime there, basically a colonial regime like the Shah's, right? In other words, regime change, as it's called. So I don't know which of these objectives was being pursued, so I can't really judge whether this action was necessary or not at that moment. What I can say is that out of all three objectives, the strikes only achieve the first one for a certain period of time, and even in the long run, they don't really accomplish even that. So what I mean by that, with strikes, you can destroy specific reactors, specific facilities, specific missiles. Logically, is it possible? Yes, it is.
yes.
But with strikes alone, you can't guarantee that this infrastructure won't be rebuilt in the future. And most importantly, you can't ensure that, let's say, the Iranian elite will now be convinced that they absolutely have to build the bomb. because the only guarantee that this won't happen again is to actually make that bomb. So in the long run, even this approach doesn't solve the problem. But in the short term, maybe it does solve the problem. So I don't know if from Israel's perspective, there was specific information on the table that at this particular location, there's object X, and we need to destroy object X within a certain time frame, then in that case, this action makes sense. These actions can't achieve any other goals because complete denuclearization, in general, a total abandonment of Iran's entire nuclear infrastructure, simply can't be accomplished through strikes. Well, there's that notorious right to peaceful nuclear energy. Or rather, it can only be achieved if the Iranian leadership agrees to it. In other words, no matter how much you bomb Iran, if its leadership doesn't officially agree, and they won't, especially since this position is supported by most of the global south, meaning their important partners like China, Russia, and so on, the right to peaceful nuclear energy for Pakistan. There was even a resolution from Russia, China, and Pakistan affirming Iran's right to peaceful nuclear energy. That's the first point. Moreover, within this position, a window of opportunity is opening up, one that is dangerous for Israel. These countries are now raising a question that is very uncomfortable for Israel. Why is it that Iran, which is a member of the IAEA and until recently allowed all inspectors, is not allowed to have nuclear weapons? But Israel, which is not a member of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, not a member of the IAEA, is allowed to have nuclear weapons. You see, that's a pretty uncomfortable question for the Israeli leadership, right? And so carrying out this second direction is very difficult. And third, I guess, is that only time will tell whether there will be a regime change or not. One thing is clear to me. In recent times, regime change doesn't happen without boots on the ground, right? So if there's no willingness to put boots on the ground in Iran, that is, to carry out a ground operation, whether by Israeli forces or American forces, then airstrikes alone won't lead to regime change. Take Russia, for example. If missile strikes alone could bring about regime change, then after 3 years of fighting the West on Ukrainian territory, Russia would have already achieved it, right? I mean, look at how many strikes there have been, precise and powerful ones, but strikes by themselves don't lead to regime change. On the contrary, if we look at Iran as an example, we actually see a certain effect of people uniting around the flag, at least for a while, right? So during the strikes, Iran's internal conflicts seem to subside, at least according to external observations. Maybe I'm wrong, but that's what it looks like for now. And there's also a negative side effect. As we understand it, in the process of carrying out these strikes, a lot of agents were exposed and lost. Really, a huge number of agents who had been cultivated over decades. Let's be blunt, they're no longer alive. That's an important aspect.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was talking to someone yesterday, and don't laugh at me because I'm not sure how to take this information. But he's kind of a philosopher, and he told me that people don't really understand what's going on. This is the Great Battle of Babylon, which is still going on. And in those sites that the Americans bombed, there are entities present. I'm telling you, this is what he told me. You see, I was listening to all this yesterday, and it's not at all what it seems, not in the way people think. There are people who see all of this in a completely different way. This Babylonian battle. This is one of the final stages of that Babylonian battle. What do you think about those words?
I think that there definitely are people who see it that way. I mean, for example, without going too far, there's this Protestant group called the Dispensationalists, God forgive me, who want to speed up the coming of the end times and build the third temple. Yeah. And, well, they're trying to hasten the prophecies about Armageddon. For example, there's this preacher, Pat Robertson, who is basically a hardcore dispensationalist, and, well, there are communities that seriously believe in this. It might seem funny to many people, but you have to understand that these communities really do exist. They're quite close-knit, they're organized, they believe in these things, and that's why they have money. They know how the American lobbying system works. So I can easily imagine that some people who support these decisions might have these kinds of motivations. It's entirely plausible. You remember Thomas's theorem, right? If a group of people believes in something as real, then it becomes real in its consequences. So in terms of its consequences, this belief can absolutely be real. So I can quite imagine that these strikes really are a motivation, let's say, for some of the people who might have advised Trump or Netanyahu to carry out these strikes, and that it's of a religious nature. Let me tell you, I don't think this is a critical group. I don't think this is the most important group in this story. But the fact that such a group exists, yes, it does exist.
Don't you think, the way it seems to me, the world is at a very crucial and very critical moment right now? And, for example, for Iran, this is a very critical moment. Now I feel sorry for the United States of America. No matter how much Trump tried to deny it, he still got dragged into this conflict, even though he came in as a president of peace, saying there was no war and there wouldn't be a new one. He got dragged in, they still pulled him in. Now today, as far as I know, Iran struck American military bases in Qatar. That's the latest news. So now Trump has to respond somehow. The reaction in America is crazy. The Democrats are absolutely fired up about impeachment. Some Republicans are against it. Basically, Trump's whole agenda has failed, the idea that he's a peaceful president. So, are we now entering a stage where World War III is slowly starting? What's going on?
Well, again, I don't think we're heading into a third. I'm not a supporter of the World War III theory. I'm more of a supporter of the theory of the Second 30 Years' War. So this is just another front, yes, another front in the Second 30 Years' War, exactly. And I think I said it on air back then, almost a year ago, that Trump is not a president of peace. Trump is about war.
You said it, yes, you did say that.
Unfortunately, that prediction turned out to be accurate. But it's just a matter of force majeure circumstances. You know what I mean? For Trump to actually bring about peace in the world, he'd have to let go of his grasping reflexes, like we discussed, and take truly decisive action against, well, that's the mystery, you see? We're both in the same position here. Honestly, half the magic of the movement right now is that people are just as puzzled. Either the deep state has some major compromat on him, or maybe he's always been that much of an opportunist, at least from their point of view. But these are real questions, yeah. At the very least, in this conflict with these so-called neocons, to the surprise of most observers, Trump for some reason took the side of the neocons. That's an objective fact. We see Carlson and Taylor Greene and Musk. We see how Trump consistently pushes away all the ideological supporters of the MAGA movement. It's really hard to understand from the outside why he decided to do this now. But maybe, I think there's a pretty simple personal story behind it. Well, first of all, we should remember that Trump genuinely hates Iran for a very specific reason, because it was Obama who made the deal with Iran back in the day.
Yep.
And Trump genuinely hates everything that Obama has ever touched. It's like he has a personal vendetta about it. He really does have it. It's true, he really does. But that's only half the problem. The second thing, notice we've talked about this. It's already been half a year of his presidency. Yeah, 6 months. There haven't been any major successes. Or rather, well, very few, either none or just a few. He hasn't had many achievements, especially considering the expectations that people had. And it's quite possible that, I don't know, the intelligence services reported that he could score a quick, loud, and flashy victory over Iran, that, just poke it with a finger and the regime would collapse or something like that. Or, peace through strength. His motto is peace through strength. So bomb them, make peace, basically, be strong. But it seems to me that at this stage, against the backdrop of growing problems both inside the country and within his close circle, and within the American president's inner circle, there's a really strong need to appear strong, to look like someone who gets results. And it's quite possible that it seemed like this was the area where that could be achieved. But I can't give you a better analysis here because things are happening very quickly, events are unfolding very inconsistently, and without some kind of exclusive secret information, it's really, really hard to draw any solid conclusions. But what really struck me was Tucker Carlson's face in the past few days. He had such a genuine, deep sense of surprise if you saw his latest interview.
Yes, I saw it, yes. Tell me what's scarier for the West, a military defeat or losing the metabolic center of its civilization?
Losing their status. I mean, they're fighting for their status, of course. This fundamental status is basically the right to look at everyone else as if they're slaves. That's the West's fundamental status. In simple terms, it's like saying, the whole world is our gas station. Sometimes they call it a rules-based order. And you have to understand that Trump, he's supposedly against, let's say, the globalists, but what's his reasoning for being against the globalists? He's against the globalists because they try to wrap all of this up in the packaging of democracy and human rights. He couldn't care less about any of that, and that's the truth. But just like any globalist, he's convinced that the United States is a chosen nation with the right to project and impose its will anywhere in the world at any time. In this regard, he's genuinely convinced. Sorry, let me finish. And so this drive to defend that right and that status is really the main battleground, one of the main battlegrounds in this 30-year war that's being fought right now.
So who do you think determines U.S. policy in the Middle East today? The White House, the military-industrial complex, or is it Israel after all?
The eternal question. I think it's everyone together and no one in particular. To understand this, we need to take a step back and look at the structure of American government. You see, in America, there isn't a state in the way we understand it in Russia, right? It's more like America is more like, a gathering of pirate clans where different pirate companies take on private contracts for this or that mission, depending on how the poker hand was dealt. Well, that's how it is at the moment. So on any given day, it could be Israel, or on another day, the military-industrial complex. Basically, whoever lobbied harder, whoever managed to get to the right ears or push the right buttons first thing in the morning, that's who ends up shaping things. But strategically, well, at the same time, there is a strategic. So it's like there are private interests, then it's easier to think of it as private military companies. I forgot there was a report called The Road to Persia, written in 2009. And this scenario, this playbook, is being implemented step by step. So basically, there's a group that's carrying out this scenario. But it's very important to understand that it's a specific group, not the American government as a whole. That's a really big problem for us in terms of perception. Honestly, I myself only recently realized, after spending some time living in America, that America doesn't have a state in the sense that the Russian language implies. That's why, by the way, it's actually impossible to make an agreement with America in the strict sense, because there's no single entity you could make an agreement with as a state. Basically, a clan doesn't consider a deal made with another clan to be binding for itself.
Tell me, does the global elite have any idea today besides self-preservation and control? Or are we witnessing the end of ideological history altogether?
Good question, Steve. Well, there is the idea of self-preservation. In general, global ideas haven't gone anywhere. They're still there. It depends on the group. The question is about the forms, right? Meaning how these ideas are put into practice. There are still ideas about some kind of global governance structure. So it exists, it hasn't disappeared. There are ideas like, for example, that old thing, population control and like environmentalism, all that stuff hasn't really gone anywhere either. A lot of people still have that feeling inside, How can I explain it to you? The elites live with the feeling that they have this double mission. On one hand, to prevent some kind of impending apocalypse, as they see it. That's where all these scary apocalyptic predictions come from. On the other hand, they live by the principle of the system has become too complex to manage. We need to create a new, simpler system. You see.
And will that destroy it?
And that ends up destroying it, yes. So this also works in the process because you see, it's always like this. Whenever there's a contradiction between the complexity of the system being managed and the ability of the control mechanism to manage that system, everything happens just like in that joke about little Vavachka, whose dad got fired from his job. He comes home all sad, I got fired, there will be less money. So, Dad, are you going to drink less? No, son, you're going to eat less.
Yes.
That's basically the general picture, and that's how it works here. But overall, you're absolutely getting to the heart of the matter. The fundamental problem right now is that against the backdrop of increasingly complex processes, growing chaos, and a constant sense of things slipping out of control, the quality of the current ruling elite's management is steadily declining. We see this in America, we see it in Western Europe, we see it in a number of other countries, and we see it in Iran as well. In fact, I think we even see it in Israel. In other words, all these events are of roughly the same nature. And unfortunately, in history, it's very rare for the elite to go through a period of internal restructuring, internal cleansing, simply for the sake of their own survival, without first reaching a point of extreme fear, extreme danger, or an existential threat. That's why I think we're still a long way from the end of this catharsis.
Then explain to me, man, why doesn't the elite build great projects anymore? No cities, no empires, no meanings. Everything has been reduced to managing flows and being afraid of chaos. That's it.
No, why do you say that? They did build things. You just didn't like it. Look, Greta Thunberg was out there traveling around. And they organized Eurovision. Well, come on, that's the kind of thing they do, you know? Listen, the last really big, grand project they truly believed in was that silly Imagine by John Lennon. John Lennon, remember? That whole Imagine there's nothing, just people, and let's all hug each other thing. Basically, just the global hippie commune. But the thing is, in this global hippie commune, some people get to set the rules, and others don't. But honestly, they really thought, hey, that's a good project. You know what I mean? Here's another example of their big global project. They genuinely believe that if we feed everyone and meet all their material needs, then everyone will be happy. And, you see, from their point of view, and the statistics actually back this up, humanity has never lived as well materially as it has in the last 30 years or so. Really, in terms of material needs, it's been something crazy, unbelievable in terms of consumption. So, the elites tried it, but this global project didn't work out either. Fundamentally, nothing has really gotten any better.
Can we say that today's global elites are perhaps the last heirs of Roman thinking, but without Roman virtue and discipline?
Although, that's a question from the chat. No, they're not really Roman. They're Enlightenment thinkers. They're an Enlightenment elite. They come from that tradition, Freemasons, Enlightenment thinkers. It's more about that. That whole story, the 18th century.
Uh-huh. Okay, no,
But they betrayed. But the stories they tell about themselves, yeah, they say they all come from Rome. And even from Egypt.
No, well, yeah, I agree. Tell me, please, do you think Iran could provoke a regional war with Saudi Arabia or Israel in order to break out of this blockade?
I think that Israel, as far as we can see, the Israeli leadership really doesn't want to. Let's put it this way. To do this, but I think they'll have to, if you will. Right? Let me explain. Let me explain what I mean. Honestly, from a game theory perspective, I don't see how this situation can be resolved without further escalation. Well, look, you have Benjamin Netanyahu. What kind of deal is he really facing? I mean, if after all of this, Israel ends up with limited nuclear energy and all the sanctions are lifted, then it's not clear at all why he started all of this in the first place.
Okay.
With the same regime in place, right? So basically, he can't back down. For Iran, as you correctly understand, it's a matter of survival. For them too, ultimately, backing down isn't an option. Trump's position is, on the one hand, more flexible, but on the other hand, as we're discussing today, there are a lot of questions. So if he doesn't achieve some major success, then again, it's not clear why he did all of this, right?
Yeah. So it turns out.
You know, it's just like, we keep ending up in this situation. It seems to me, nobody wanted war, but war was inevitable. But still, if you ask me, does Israel want, I don't know, a war with Saudi Arabia? Of course not. Do they want to block the Persian Gulf? From the perspective of really wanting it, intentionally, you know. I don't see any particular desire for that either. But if they're backed into a corner, of course, they don't have many strong cards left to play. Shutting down the strait is one of the few strong cards they have. So, most likely, if the escalation continues, and right now I don't see any real reason for it to stop. Yeah.
Then I don't understand why Washington is ramping up escalation on 3 fronts at once: China, Iran, and Russia. It's either strategic suicide or a clever calculation.
Honestly, I don't think anyone knows. I don't know.
Interesting.
I don't think anyone knows. Maybe it's just the principle of, well, maybe we'll get lucky somewhere. Honestly, that's the kind of principle it seems to be. You know, like winning on one front and losing on another. Maybe no one will even notice the defeat. It's tough. But Washington, we've talked about this. You know, it's kind of the recurring theme of our broadcasts. In Ukraine, they're not achieving what they wanted to accomplish. Putin isn't going for those great deals. And the fact that he won't go for them, well, we've been saying that for the past 6 months too. Because the way it is, you know, you're asking without respect. And the deal that Putin is actually willing to make, he's repeated it again. And honestly, if they were smart, the US could actually agree to it. The US wouldn't really lose anything significant there. But for that, they have to loosen their grip. We've said that there's a fundamental problem here. And with Iran, that's the Israeli story. It's really all a continuation of what happened on October 7th. Everything has been going on since then, because the core issue from October 7th hasn't gone anywhere. I mean, it's still unclear what to do about Palestine, right? I mean, like Trump said, I'll bring peace to the Middle East. How are you going to bring peace to the Middle East? Well, apparently, the only way to bring peace to the Middle East, as some in Trump's circle see it, is to ensure some kind of total victory for Israel over everyone around it who resists. Well, logically, that's actually a conceivable scenario. But you have to actually do it, right? And now we see
Yeah.
just how hard it is to pull off. That's the situation we're in. The main problem is that it's unclear whether it's even possible to carry out all these grand plans. There are a lot of different opinions about this. I'm more skeptical about them. Honestly, I'm more skeptical about them.
Tell me, I'm curious about Ukraine. Ukraine has kind of faded into the background. Notice that no one really talks about it anymore, especially now with Israel, Xusha. So what's actually happening in Ukraine right now? What are your thoughts on it? How much longer do you think this will go on?
I don't know. You see, I'll say it again, we just don't know. This could go on for a month, or it could last another 2 years. It will keep going as long as there's really only one key factor we can watch for, and that's the collapse of the front line. The front will collapse when one side runs out of motivated infantry. Meaning infantry who are able to hold the line, right? In other words, replenishing this mobilization resource. This is a matter that's both quantitative and qualitative. No one knows how long this will go on, but the direction remains the same. So, what's going to happen is simply what's going to happen. Russia will keep increasing its strikes on military infrastructure. Well, what we've been seeing in recent days is a continuation of the slow but relentless movement on the front, grinding down that very same mobilization resource, and responding to the situation as it develops.
Tell me, how do you see the possible scenarios for Russia's future in the 2020s and 2030s? Consolidation or a new time of troubles?
Free will, dear Steve. It all depends on what decisions will be made. Everything depends on what decisions are made, what words are spoken, what symbols are raised on banners, what ethics are placed in the heart. That's what everything depends on. There are just so many unknown variables.
And I have one more question for today. I won't bother you any longer. What's your attitude toward artificial intelligence in general? Because the same person I was talking to yesterday, you know what he told me? Just don't laugh, okay? People think artificial intelligence, he said. It's not artificial intelligence. It's, he said, a genie trapped, he said, in a bottle. You get it? So, can you explain what that means? He said, and then just wait and see what happens when that genie gets out.
Look, I can tell you for sure that for me, this topic deserves a whole separate show. It's really complicated, because it's a very complex phenomenon with a lot of different aspects. I have students who are involved, well, who work in this field, so there are a lot of different layers to it. First of all, let me start by saying this. I'll reassure you at first, and then maybe I'll worry you a bit. Here's the reassuring part. At this point, of course, it's not really artificial intelligence. It's just an imitation of intelligence. Strictly speaking, it's not actually thinking yet. It's just really, 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 really good at combining things. I don't know. Do you remember? Well, you probably remember. There used to be. When we wrote text messages, we used T9, right? So it would automatically suggest words as you typed. The current version of artificial intelligence is basically T9 on steroids, right? So, for now, it's not a very strong intelligence. We'll see what happens in the future. But regarding what your friend told you, unfortunately, I know that over there in Silicon Valley, there really are people who seriously, among those developing these programs, genuinely treat them as artificial gods and actually pray to them. That's also true.
Yeah, that's cool. So, can we say that artificial intelligence today is a new form of the sacred, into which the global elite have invested the idea of God and providence?
Look, for now, it's not that widespread. There are some members of the elite who, yes, want to create an artificial God for themselves. There are people like that.
Because, look, if artificial intelligence writes music, poetry, manages the economy, and influences consciousness, then a person goes from being a creator to just an observer. So, does this mean it's the end of the humanist era? Let's say, I have my own intelligence, even with my awesome intelligence. I use it, right? It knows everything about me. It adapts to me. And when you interact with it, it already talks to you like a close friend and does everything for you, so there's really nothing left for you to do or look for. You don't need a secretary anymore. Like I have a secretary, for example. You don't need anything. You give a command, and it does everything. So it turns out that a person just becomes an observer. That's it. The creator has ceased to exist.
Well, look, what you're describing now is an apocalyptic scenario, which is just one of the possible outcomes. I'll say it again, I'm not that deeply immersed in the topic yet. At the moment, all I can say is that there are groups who treat this machine that way and, being unable to believe in God, want to create an artificial God for themselves, that very same golem from Jewish history, an idol, and that's the whole story, so to speak. This phenomenon does exist. But just so your listeners don't get scared, for the most part, the people who are developing these things aren't even thinking about stuff like that. Maybe that's even scarier, because if we look at a recent interesting interview with Sam Altman, the developer from OpenAI, if you know, honestly, the level of humanity's knowledge he showed and demonstrated is kind of frightening. That is, she is scared. So in that sense, it's really like a Pandora's box, you know, in the fact that it's a Pandora's box. Look, we know for sure that it's a Pandora's box. Recently, MIT published a study about the effects of using artificial intelligence on the user's brain, and it actually has a biological effect. So again, we're creating a very powerful technical tool with unpredictable long-term consequences, without even pausing for a second to think about how we're going to deal with it. This is where I see a real, objective danger, regardless of any mystical stories.
Is artificial intelligence simply about freeing people from routine, or is it actually the beginning of civilized slavery?
It depends on how we handle it. It could become either one. The short answer is, it could become either, or even both. And given our tendency to choose the dumbest and most insane scenario out of all possible options, there's a good chance that, yes, artificial intelligence will just speed up the process of mass dumbing down. By the way, that's already a side effect we're seeing right now. Artificial intelligence is cutting off, you know, it will very quickly destroy the institution of modern higher education, because today's universities don't really teach anything anyway. If, during the learning process, students have already switched completely to artificial intelligence, he writes essays, he does homework for them. So basically, the only skill you're developing now in a modern university is the skill of writing prompts, meaning the skill of asking questions to artificial intelligence. Forgive me. Paying $100,000 for that seems kind of expensive. And honestly, the value of that diploma becomes completely unclear. Paradoxically, the only type of education that becomes valuable in the age of artificial intelligence is semi-individual or small group learning with a live teacher, because the only thing artificial intelligence can't fake is when I, as a teacher, interact with a student and make them think.
You know, I recently uploaded my blood test results into my artificial intelligence, and it quickly broke everything down for me. I didn't even need a doctor anymore. It told me everything from A to Z, what medications to take, where to go, what to do. After that, you just sit there and here's the question. Artificial intelligence itself throws down a challenge to the very concept of the soul. Is it possible to copy consciousness without destroying a person's uniqueness?
It doesn't really challenge the soul at all. That's you getting into a theological question. I'll tell you what you wrote. What it actually challenges are, let's say, it challenges our professions or areas of life that are based on that very same combinatorics, on large sets of data, right? And when it comes to the ability for true creativity, artificial intelligence just isn't capable of that. Everything artificial intelligence does is just reassembling old creative works or analyzing large data sets. So, paradoxically, the one thing artificial intelligence still can't copy is exactly where humans remain unique, and in my opinion, it's just that we don't learn this, and we don't want to learn it, and that's creativity in the broadest, deepest sense. Creativity is analysis. Creativity is the ability to catch neural connections, or rather, not just neural, but deep connections, the most paradoxical conclusions. Philosophy. Artificial intelligence can't do any of that, because don't forget, artificial intelligence, well, we all play around with it, we look at it, we try to figure out what it is. But it doesn't actually create anything new. Everything it creates is just a mirror of you.
Ever.
You see what I mean? However I ask it, that's exactly how it'll answer me. It won't tell me anything fundamentally new. So, you ask a question, and that's the answer you get. There's no real creativity there. It's just a mirror of the person asking the question. And that brings us back to the responsibility of what kind of questioners we are, what kind of people we are. Now, that's an interesting question.
Tell me, please, what can replace God in a world where religion is turned into marketing? What?
Nothing. Absolutely nothing. Nothing can replace God. God was, is, and always will be. He is the Alpha and the Omega. That's why it's impossible to replace God. And those people who have replaced God with marketing end up with the from the cradle to the grave program, from abortion to euthanasia, just like what's happening now in the UK. So, it's not about replacing God. It's about replacing the human being. That's what's really happening.
Many thanks to those who challenged us with questions.
Great questions, Steve. Excellent.
You see, everything is going in such an unclear direction. It kind of makes sense. But it's still a bit of an unclear direction, and I think we're living as if we're inside a history textbook. That's why, for some reason, I feel like our time, what's happening right now, it's as if we're living through history being written, like we're part of some chapter in history. Although, maybe I'm wrong, because people say everything goes in circles, that it's all happened somewhere before, but honestly, I don't really see that it's ever happened quite like this before, you know? So there are some really interesting moments. Once again, thank you so much for your time, Ann.
Thank you, Steve. Take care.
Thanks again.
All the best, wishing you all the very best.